On a crisp autumn afternoon in suburban Atlanta, 14-year-old Marcus Johnson walked along Maple Street with his basketball tucked under his arm. His navy blue practice jersey was still damp with sweat from the intense 2-hour training session at Riverside Middle School. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the tree-lined street as he made his way home. Marcus was well known in his neighborhood, not just for his promising basketball skills, but for his kind heart and gentle demeanor. Standing at 5'8", he was tall for his age, with warm brown eyes that always seemed to notice when someone needed help. His mother had raised him with strong values, teaching him that true strength lay in helping others. Every weekend, Marcus could be found at the Greater Hope Baptist Church, where he volunteered at their food bank. He would spend hours organizing canned goods, carrying heavy boxes for the elderly volunteers, and helping visitors load groceries into their cars. Pastor Williams often said that Marcus was a blessing to their community, the kind of young man who gave people hope for the future. Today had been particularly challenging at basketball practice. Coach Thompson had pushed the team harder than usual, preparing them for the upcoming district championships. Marcus's muscles ached, and all he could think about was getting home to enjoy his mother's famous meatloaf, which she always prepared on Thursdays. As he walked, Marcus thought about his father, who had passed away 3 years ago. His dad had been a postal worker, known throughout the neighborhood for going above and beyond to help people on his route. "Always look out for others, son," he would say. "Sometimes a small act of kindness can change someone's entire day." These words had become Marcus's personal motto. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with most people still at work. Mrs. Peterson was watering her prized roses, and she waved as Marcus passed by. Mr. Rodriguez, the retired mechanic, was tinkering with his classic car in his driveway. These familiar faces and daily routines made the neighborhood feel like one big family. Marcus checked his phone. It was 4:30 p.m. His mother wouldn't be home from her nursing shift until 6 o'clock p.m., which meant he had time to finish his algebra homework before dinner. He was a good student, maintaining a B+ average despite his busy schedule with basketball and volunteering. His teachers often commented on his focus and determination, traits that served him well both on and off the court. As he approached the busy intersection of Maple and Oak Streets, Marcus noticed more cars than usual. Construction work on the main highway had diverted traffic through their normally peaceful neighborhood. The increased traffic had been a source of concern for many residents, especially the elderly ones who lived alone. Marcus paused at the corner store, debating whether to buy a sports drink to quench his thirst. Through the store's window, you could see Mr. Kim, the owner, restocking shelves. The store had been a neighborhood fixture for 20 years, and Mr. Kim knew everyone by name. Just last week, Marcus had helped him clean up after a small flood in the storage room. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of someone grilling nearby. Marcus's stomach growled, reminding him of his hunger after practice. He decided to save his money and wait for dinner instead. His mother had taught him the value of saving, and he was trying to build up his college fund, even though it was still several years away. As he waited for the traffic light to change, Marcus noticed an elderly woman approaching the intersection. He recognized her as Mrs. Henderson from 2 blocks over. She moved slowly with her walker, looking uncertain as she faced the busy street. Marcus had seen her at church occasionally, though they had never spoken directly. The sight of Mrs. Henderson triggered a memory of his grandmother, who had also used a walker in her final years. Before she passed away, she would often talk about how challenging it had become to do simple things like crossing the street. Marcus remembered how grateful she had been when people took the time to help her. The traffic light turned red, and cars began to pile up at the intersection. Mrs. Henderson stood at the corner, her hands trembling slightly on her walker as she watched the rushing vehicles. Marcus could see the concern on her face as she contemplated crossing the wide street alone. Without hesitation, Marcus adjusted his backpack and began walking toward Mrs. Henderson. His father's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes a small act of kindness can change someone's entire day. He had no way of knowing that this simple decision would lead to an event that would change not just a day, but many lives in their community. Marcus approached Mrs. Henderson with a warm smile, careful not to startle her. The elderly woman looked up at him, her gray hair neatly styled beneath a light blue scarf. She was wearing a floral dress and comfortable walking shoes, clutching her metal walker with both hands. "Would you like some help crossing the street, ma'am?" Marcus asked politely, remembering to speak clearly and a bit louder, just as he had done with his grandmother. Mrs. Henderson's face brightened with relief. "Oh, yes, dear, that would be wonderful. My arthritis is acting up something fierce today." Her voice was gentle, with a slight southern accent that reminded Marcus of warm summer evenings and sweet tea. As they waited for the walk signal, Mrs. Henderson shared that she was returning from her weekly doctor's appointment. Usually, her daughter drove her, but today she had an important meeting at work. The bus had dropped her off a block away, and she had been worried about managing the busy intersection alone. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he introduced himself, still holding his basketball. "I think I've seen you at Greater Hope Baptist Church." "Oh, yes." Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with recognition. "You're Catherine's boy. Your mother is a nurse at Memorial Hospital. She took care of my husband last year when he had his hip surgery. Such a kind woman." The walk signal finally turned green, and Marcus positioned himself slightly behind Mrs. Henderson's left side. "We'll take it nice and slow, ma'am. No rush at all." He kept pace with her measured steps, making sure she felt secure. As they began crossing, Mrs. Henderson told Marcus about her 3 grandchildren. Her eldest grandson was also on a basketball team in another state. "He's not as tall as you, though," she chuckled, her walker making soft clicking sounds against the pavement. They were about halfway across when the rushing sound of an approaching vehicle made them both look up. A red pickup truck had stopped at the light, its engine rumbling loudly. The driver, a middle-aged man with sunglasses and a baseball cap, was staring at them intently. Marcus noticed Mrs. Henderson's hands tighten on her walker. The man's intense gaze made him uncomfortable, but he remembered what his mother always said: "Keep your head high and your heart kind, no matter what others might think." They continued their careful journey across the street. Mrs. Henderson told Marcus about how the neighborhood had changed over the 40 years she'd lived there. "Used to be all farmland where your school is now," she said, her voice growing stronger as she shared her memories. Just as they were a few steps from the curb, the man in the pickup truck suddenly pulled out his phone and began recording them. Marcus could see him clearly now through the truck's open window, his face set in a harsh frown, his movements aggressive as he pointed the phone in their direction. "You okay there, ma'am?" The man called out loudly, his voice carrying a tone that made Marcus's stomach tighten. "Is this boy bothering you?" Mrs. Henderson looked startled by the man's question. "Why, absolutely not," she responded firmly. "This young gentleman is helping me cross the street." But the man wasn't listening. He was already dialing another number on a second phone, his eyes never leaving Marcus. The basketball beneath Marcus's arm felt suddenly heavy, and he could feel his heart beginning to race. Other pedestrians had stopped to watch the scene unfold. A young woman with shopping bags paused near the corner, her own phone now in her hand. An older man walking his dog had also stopped, looking concerned. Mrs. Henderson reached the curb, and Marcus helped her step up safely. She turned to thank him, but her words were cut short by the truck driver's loud voice. "Yes, police. I want to report a suspicious teenager harassing an elderly woman at the corner of Maple and Oak." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he heard these words. The kind act he had intended, just like the ones his father had taught him about, was being twisted into something ugly. Mrs. Henderson's face showed a mix of shock and anger as she realized what was happening. The autumn afternoon that had started so normally was about to become something neither of them had expected. The sound of distant sirens could already be heard, growing closer with each passing second. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed with anger as she turned to face the man in the red pickup truck. Despite her arthritis, she stood as tall as she could, her walker planted firmly on the sidewalk. Marcus remained beside her, his heart pounding but his expression calm, just as his mother had taught him to be in difficult situations. "Young man," Mrs. Henderson said to Marcus, loud enough for everyone to hear, "please stay right here with me. We're going to sort this nonsense out." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen many decades of life and wouldn't tolerate injustice. More people had gathered around them now. Mr. Kim had stepped out of his corner store, still wearing his green apron. A group of high school students had stopped their bikes, phones out, recording the scene. 2 mothers with strollers stood nearby, shaking their heads at the truck driver's behavior. The man in the truck continued his performance, speaking loudly into his phone. "Yes, I'm watching him right now." He came up to her with a basketball, Could be trying to distract her to steal her purse. I've seen this kind of thing before. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through his false narrative like a knife through butter. How dare you? She called out. This kind young man helped me cross the street when he saw me struggling. I'd known this family for years. A young woman in business attire stepped forward, her own phone recording. I saw the whole thing, she announced. That boy was nothing but helpful and respectful. You're making up stories, sir. Marcus stood quietly, his basketball still tucked under his arm. His father's words came back to him. Son, there will be times when people judge you without knowing you. That's their weakness, not yours. He took a deep breath, keeping his composure even as his hands trembled slightly. Mr. Kim had moved closer to Marcus, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. I see this boy help people all the time, he stated firmly. He's a good kid. You should be ashamed of yourself, he added, directing his words at the truck driver. The sound of sirens grew louder. Marcus could see 2 police cars turning onto Maple Street, their lights flashing. His stomach tightened, but Mrs. Henderson's presence beside him gave him courage. She had taken out her phone and was already dialing a number. I'm calling your mother, dear, she told Marcus. And then I'm calling Pastor Williams. This nonsense has gone far enough. The truck driver had finally stopped talking into his phone, but he continued recording, his face now showing uncertainty as he realized how many witnesses were gathering. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the tension in the air. One of the high school students who had stopped spoke up. Hey, aren't you Marcus Johnson? You played an amazing game against our school last week. You're the one who organized the food drive for the homeless shelter too, right? Marcus nodded quietly, grateful for the show of support. More people from the neighborhood had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Peterson, still wearing her gardening gloves, hurried over from her yard. What's going on here? Marcus, are you all right? The police cars pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers stepped out. The first was Officer Martinez, who Marcus recognized from community basketball games at the park. The second was Officer Chen, who regularly patrolled the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson straightened her scarf and gripped her walker firmly. Officers, she called out clearly, I need to file a complaint about that man in the truck. He's been harassing this young man who kindly helped me cross the street. The gathered crowd began to voice their agreement, many holding up their phones to show the recordings they'd made. The truck driver's face had lost its aggressive confidence, replaced by a look of growing discomfort as he realized how his actions would appear to the officers. Marcus watched as Officer Martinez approached the truck while Officer Chen walked toward him and Mrs. Henderson. The sun was lower now, casting an orange glow over the scene. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger, a moment when an entire community came together to stand against prejudice and defend what was right. Officer Chen approached Marcus and Mrs. Henderson with a calm, professional demeanor. The evening air had grown cooler, and more neighbors continued to gather around the scene. The sound of cars passing by had quieted, as if the whole street was holding its breath. Ma'am, can you tell me what happened here? Officer Chen asked Mrs. Henderson, taking out his notepad. His voice was steady and reassuring, helping to ease some of the tension in the air. Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, a familiar voice called out from the crowd. Marcus, baby, are you okay? It was Kathleen Johnson, Marcus's mother, still wearing her hospital scrubs. She must have left work early after receiving Mrs. Henderson's call. Marcus felt a wave of relief as his mother reached him, wrapping her arm protectively around his shoulders. I'm okay, Mom, he said softly, though his heart was still racing from the incident. Mrs. Henderson began explaining the situation to Officer Chen, her voice clear and determined. I was struggling to cross this busy intersection when this wonderful young man offered to help me. He was nothing but respectful and kind, just like his father raised him to be. She gestured toward the red truck. Then that man started causing trouble, making up horrible lies and calling the police. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez was speaking with the truck driver, whose bravado had deflated considerably. The man's phone was no longer recording, and his baseball cap was crumpled in his hands as he tried to explain his actions. Several witnesses stepped forward to give their accounts. Mr. Kim described how he had watched the entire interaction from his store window. The young businesswoman showed Officer Chen the video she had recorded, which clearly captured the truck driver's false accusations. Catherine Johnson stood tall beside her son, her nurse's badge still pinned to her scrubs. "My son has been raised to help others," she stated firmly. His father taught him that before he passed, and Marcus has always honored that teaching. Officer Chen nodded as he continued taking notes. More patrol cars had arrived, and the street was now bathed in the rotating blue and red lights. The truck driver's face had grown pale as he realized the seriousness of his actions. Pastor Williams arrived from the church, his presence adding another layer of support to the gathering. He walked directly to Marcus and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This young man represents the very best of our community," he announced to the officers. Mrs. Henderson had settled onto a bench that Mr. Kim had brought out from his store. Despite her arthritis, she remained alert and engaged, providing clear details to the police. "I want to press charges," she declared. "This kind of behavior has no place in our neighborhood." The truck driver's voice could be heard trying to backtrack. "I was just concerned for her safety," he stammered to Officer Martinez. "I thought." "You thought what, exactly?" Officer Martinez interrupted, his tone professional but firm. "That a young man helping an elderly woman cross the street must be up to no good. Based on what evidence?" The gathered crowd murmured in disapproval. Some of the high school students who had stopped earlier were still there, their phones documenting everything. One of them spoke up. "This is going on social media. People need to see what happened here." Marcus remained quiet through all of this, his basketball still tucked under his arm like an anchor. His mother kept her arm around him, and he could feel her slight trembling, not from fear, but from controlled anger at how her son had been treated. The autumn sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the scene. The street lights had begun to flicker on, one by one. What had started as a simple act of kindness had transformed into a moment that would be remembered in their community for years to come. Officer Chen finished taking statements and turned to Marcus. "You did everything right today, son," he said kindly. "Don't let this experience stop you from being who you are." Mrs. Henderson reached out and patted Marcus's hand. "Next Sunday at church," she said with a warm smile, "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what a hero you are. And I'm bringing my famous peach cobbler just for you." The scene continued to unfold as official reports were filed and witnesses gave their statements. The incident was far from over, but the community's swift response had turned a moment of prejudice into a powerful display of unity and support. As the evening deepened, the incident at the intersection of Maple and Oak Streets transformed into something larger than anyone had expected. The gathering of neighbors had grown even larger, with local news vans pulling up to cover the story. The flashing lights from police cars cast alternating blue and red glows across concerned faces. Officer Martinez was now reading the truck driver his rights. The man, identified as James Cooper from the other side of town, had begun to realize the serious consequences of his actions. His false police report and racist assumptions would have legal ramifications. "Sir, making false reports to law enforcement is a criminal offense," Officer Martinez explained, his voice firm but professional. "Additionally, we have multiple witnesses and video evidence of your harassment of a minor." Marcus's mother, Catherine, was speaking with a police sergeant, her nursing badge catching the light as she gestured. Her voice carried the controlled anger of a parent protecting her child. "This has to stop. Our children shouldn't have to fear helping others because of the color of their skin." Mrs. Henderson had refused to leave Marcus's side, despite her daughter arriving to take her home. "Sarah," she told her worried daughter, "I'm staying right here until this is properly handled. This young man stood by me, and I'm standing by him." The local news reporters had begun interviewing witnesses. Mr. Kim described how Marcus regularly helped elderly customers carry their groceries. The young businesswoman shared her video with the news crew, showing the stark contrast between Marcus's kindness and Cooper's unfounded accusations. Pastor Williams was addressing a group of concerned parents who had gathered. "This is a teaching moment," he said solemnly. "We must show our young people that when hatred shows its face, the community will rise to defeat it." Marcus sat on the bench outside Mr. Kim's store, his basketball now at his feet. The events felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than his everyday life. A young reporter approached him, microphone in hand, but Catherine stepped in protectively. "My son has been through enough today," she stated firmly. He was simply being the young man his father and I raised him to be. Officer Chen returned with some paperwork. We'll need statements from both Marcus and Mrs. Henderson. But first, I want you to know we're taking this very seriously. The department has a zero-tolerance policy for these kinds of false reports. Cooper was now sitting in the back of a police car, his red truck being examined by other officers. His phone had been confiscated as evidence, and his face showed a mix of anger and embarrassment through the car window. The high school students who had witnessed everything had already posted their videos online. Their phones buzzed constantly with notifications as the posts began to go viral. It's getting picked up by major news sites, one of them announced. People are sharing it everywhere. Mrs. Henderson's daughter brought her mother a chair and a glass of water, but the elderly woman remained engaged and alert. In all my years, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I've never seen such blatant prejudice met with such powerful community response. This is how change happens. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. I just wanted to help Mrs. Henderson cross the street, like my dad would have done, like anyone should do. His simple statement brought tears to several eyes in the crowd. Catherine hugged her son closer, remembering her late husband's words about raising their boy to be both strong and kind. The streetlights were fully on now, creating pools of light in the growing darkness. More neighbors had brought out chairs and beverages, turning the scene into an impromptu community gathering. What had begun as an act of racism was transforming into a demonstration of unity. Officer Martinez approached Marcus with a small smile. You know, we need more young people like you in law enforcement. Have you ever considered becoming a police officer? Before Marcus could answer, another police car arrived. Inside was the police chief himself, having heard about the incident. As he stepped out of his car, the crowd parted, and the evening prepared to enter its next phase. The story of the kind black boy who helped an old lady cross the street was about to become a catalyst for change in their community. Police Chief Richardson walked through the gathered crowd with measured steps, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a tall man with graying hair and over 30 years of law enforcement experience. More importantly, he had grown up in this very neighborhood and understood its heart. Mrs. Henderson, he said warmly, approaching the elderly woman. My mother plays bridge with you at the senior center. When I heard what happened, I had to come personally. He turned to Marcus and his mother. And Catherine, I remember when Marcus was born. Your husband Robert was so proud. The mention of his father made Marcus stand a little straighter. Chief Richardson placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. Son, I want you to know that what happened here today isn't just about a false police report. It's about right and wrong, and you did everything right. Meanwhile, James Cooper was being processed by Officer Martinez. The charges were serious: filing a false police report, harassment of a minor, and potential hate crime charges given the racial nature of his assumptions and actions. His red truck was being towed away as evidence. The news crews had set up proper lighting now, transforming the street corner into what looked like a film set. Local Channel 5's veteran reporter, Sandra Martinez, no relation to Officer Martinez, was preparing for a live broadcast. Her presence indicated that this story would reach far beyond their neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson's daughter had brought her mother's medical records, showing her regular Thursday doctor appointments and bus schedule, further confirming the truth of the events. My mother has been taking this route for years, she explained to Officer Chen. Until today, she's never had anyone kind enough to help her cross this busy street. Pastor Williams was organizing an impromptu community meeting for the following evening at Greater Hope Baptist Church. We need to discuss how to prevent incidents like this, he announced. But we also need to celebrate young people like Marcus who represent the best of our community values. Mr. Kim had reopened his store and was handing out free bottles of water to everyone. His security cameras had captured the entire incident, and technicians from the police department were making copies of the footage. Chief Richardson addressed the gathered crowd. What we've seen today represents both the worst and the best of our society. We saw prejudice and false assumptions, but we also saw a community stand up for what's right. This is how real change happens, not through grand gestures, but through everyday acts of kindness and courage. Marcus's basketball teammate, Jerome, had arrived after hearing about the incident. He stood by his friend, their team jerseys a reminder that they were just teenagers who should have been worrying about their next game, not dealing with racial prejudice. Katherine Johnson spoke with Chief Richardson about filing a formal complaint. This has to be documented, she insisted. Not just for Marcus, but for every child who might face something similar. Mrs. Henderson, despite her arthritis acting up, remained engaged in the proceedings. I want to testify, she declared firmly. People need to hear from a grandmother who's lived in this neighborhood for 40 years about how this young man behaved versus how he was treated. The high school students who had recorded everything were now showing their videos to the police technical team. Their quick thinking had provided crucial evidence that couldn't be disputed. Officer Chen returned with completed paperwork for everyone to sign. These statements will be part of the official record, he explained. They'll be important for the legal proceedings that follow. As the evening continued, the crowd began to thin slightly, but a core group remained. Those most directly involved and those most determined to see justice done. The streetlights cast a steady glow over the scene, and the autumn air had grown quite cool. Marcus finally sat down again, exhausted from the day's events. His mother wrapped her cardigan around his shoulders, and Mrs. Henderson reached over to pat his hand. The simple act of helping someone cross a street had turned into something much larger, a moment that would be remembered, discussed, and used to teach others about prejudice, community, and the power of standing together against injustice. Chief Richardson made one final statement to the news crews. Today, a young man showed us what community means. Tomorrow, we'll show him what justice means. The following morning, Marcus's story was everywhere. Local news channels played the videos on repeat, social media exploded with shares and supportive comments, and the phone at the Johnson household hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Katherine sat at their kitchen table, sorting through messages of support that had flooded their email and social media accounts. Marcus was quietly eating his breakfast, still processing the events of the previous day. The morning sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, making the whole scene feel more normal than it actually was. Your school principal called, Katherine told her son, looking up from her phone. She wants to address this during today's assembly, but only if you're comfortable with it. She paused, studying her son's face. You don't have to go to school today if you don't feel up to it. Marcus finished his cereal and shook his head. Dad always said we can't let fear or negativity change who we are. I want to go to school, Mom. As Marcus walked to school, neighbors came out of their houses to greet him. Mrs. Peterson had put up a hand-painted sign in her yard that read, "Kindness lies here." Mr. Rodriguez stood in his driveway, applauding as Marcus passed by. At Riverside Middle School, the atmosphere was electric. Students and teachers alike had seen the news coverage. Principal Turner met Marcus at the entrance, her face showing both concern and pride. You've shown everyone what real character looks like, she said, leading him to her office. Meanwhile, across town, James Cooper was appearing for his preliminary hearing. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and community activists. Mrs. Henderson had arrived early, supported by her daughter and Pastor Williams, ready to give her testimony. The district attorney had reviewed all the evidence, multiple video recordings, witness statements, and Mr. Kim's security footage. The case was solid, and Cooper's actions would have serious consequences. Back at school, Marcus sat in Principal Turner's office as she outlined the morning assembly. The mayor wants to attend, she explained. This has become bigger than just our school, Marcus. You've sparked an important conversation in our city. Marcus thought about his father, wondering what he would say about all this attention. He remembered the quiet ways his dad had helped others, never seeking recognition or praise. Could we talk about kindness in general? Marcus suggested. Not just about what happened yesterday. Principal Turner smiled, understanding exactly what Marcus meant. This wasn't about making him a hero. It was about promoting the values that had led to his actions in the first place. The school assembly was unlike any other. The gymnasium was packed not just with students, but with community members, local leaders, and even a few news cameras. Mayor Thompson spoke about the importance of standing up against prejudice. Pastor Williams talked about the power of simple acts of kindness. But it was Mrs. Henderson who stole the show. Despite her arthritis, she insisted on walking to the podium herself. Yesterday, I saw the worst and the best of humanity within a few minutes, she said, her voice strong and clear. A young man helped me cross the street, something my own grandson would have done if he were here. And for that simple act of kindness, he faced ugly prejudice. but our community stood up and said no to hatred. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Marcus sat quietly in the front row, his basketball teammates surrounding him supportively. Coach Thompson had canceled practice for the day, instead organizing a community basketball game for that evening. As the assembly ended, Principal Turner announced a new school initiative, the Kindness Crossing Project. Students would organize to help elderly neighbors with daily tasks, promoting intergenerational connections and community service. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Cooper's case was proceeding. The judge, known for her fairness, listened to the evidence with grave attention. The charges were serious, and the community was watching closely to see how justice would be served. By lunchtime, Marcus was back in his regular routine, sitting with his friends in the cafeteria. They talked about normal things: homework, basketball, weekend plans. But something had changed. Students from all grades stopped by their table, not to talk about the incident, but to share their own stories of kindness and support. The simple act of helping Mrs. Henderson cross the street had created ripples that were still spreading, touching lives and changing perspectives throughout the community. And this was just the beginning. 1 month after the incident, the corner of Maple and Oak Streets had transformed. The city had installed a new crosswalk with better lighting and safety features. A small plaque stood nearby, reading "Kindness Crossing," where community comes together. Marcus's life had found a new rhythm. Every Thursday afternoon, he and a rotating group of students from the Kindness Crossing Project would help elderly residents with their errands. Mrs. Henderson had become their unofficial coordinator, matching students with seniors who needed assistance. The legal proceedings against James Cooper had concluded. He had been found guilty of filing a false police report and harassment. The judge had sentenced him to community service at a local senior center and mandatory diversity training. More importantly, he had publicly apologized to Marcus and Mrs. Henderson. On this particular autumn afternoon, exactly 1 month since the incident, the community gathered for a special celebration. The Greater Hope Baptist Church parking lot was full of people setting up tables, hanging decorations, and preparing food for their first Community Unity Festival. Mrs. Henderson sat in her special chair near the basketball court, where Marcus and his team were playing an exhibition game against the police department's team. Officer Martinez had turned out to be a pretty good point guard, though not quite quick enough to keep up with Marcus. Katherine Johnson watched from the sidelines, her nurse's scrubs replaced with a festive dress. She thought about how proud her late husband would be of their son, not just for his initial act of kindness, but for how he had handled everything that followed. The Kindness Crossing Project had spread to other schools in the district. Principal Turner had been invited to speak at educational conferences about the program's success. Local businesses, inspired by Mr. Kim's example, had created a fund to support community initiatives. During a break in the basketball game, Mayor Thompson announced that the City Council had approved funding for similar safety improvements at intersections near senior living facilities. Sometimes, she said, it takes one moment to show us what needs to change. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around at the gathered crowd. His teammates were chatting with police officers, sharing bottles of water and trading basketball tips. Senior citizens who had once been afraid to cross busy streets were now regular visitors at school events. Mrs. Henderson's famous peach cobbler had its own table at the festival, with a long line of people waiting for a taste. She had become something of a local celebrity, appearing on news segments to talk about community building and intergenerational connections. As the afternoon wore on, Pastor Williams called everyone together for a group photo. Hundreds of people gathered, representing every part of their community. Marcus stood in the middle, not because he wanted to be the center of attention, but because everyone insisted. Mrs. Henderson sat in front of him, her walker decorated with ribbons for the festival. The photo would later hang in City Hall, the school gymnasium, and the Greater Hope Baptist Church. But its real impact was in what it represented. A community that had taken a moment of prejudice and transformed it into lasting positive change. Chief Richardson, watching the festivities, spoke quietly to Catherine. Your son didn't just help one person cross the street that day, he helped an entire community cross over to a better way of being. As the sun began to set on the festival, Marcus helped Mrs. Henderson pack up her empty cobbler dishes. You know, she said, her eyes twinkling, I think your father is watching all of this, and he's mighty proud. Marcus smiled, remembering his father's words about small acts of kindness. He looked around at the basketball court where officers and teenagers were still playing, at the tables where neighbors of all ages were sharing meals, at the children running around with Kindness Crossing t-shirts. The story of a kind black boy helping an old lady cross the street had become more than just a viral video or a legal case. It had become a reminder that community, compassion, and courage could overcome prejudice and fear. As Marcus walked home that evening, carrying his basketball and a container of leftover cobbler, he understood that sometimes the smallest actions could build the strongest bridges. The autumn breeze carried the sound of laughter and conversation from the festival, a symphony of voices that proved what his father had always taught him: kindness, in the end, was the strongest force of all.